It's very clear to us that where we tend to play is the midstream. Areas such as vessel building, construction, recycling, we have a fairly low footprint. And therefore, as I said earlier, the opportunities to play are quite interesting. But if those opportunities are to be taken, there needs to be policy support and there needs to be certain changes to the environment. But in terms of the sector's contribution to the economy, everybody is familiar with the issues around seaborne, the opportunities or the contribution through seaborne transportation. When you look at the national transportation policy, it's clear that overwhelmingly Nigeria's international trade is seaborne. But then we're also clear about the role that oil plays in Nigeria's maritime industry. Whether it's about the rigs or whether it's about the tankers, they're all there. Beyond those, of course, there are ocean assets, which in my view, Nigeria actually needs to record and be able to manage and govern properly. Indeed, one of the challenges that I would like to take this opportunity to throw to those who manage the maritime industry is the need for Nigeria to document and characterize her ocean economy, or more broadly, her blue economy. Because it's not just about the oceans, the inland waterways also represent opportunities for economic progress. And then, of course, the export processing zones we're all fully aware of. Now, again, one of the things we have done is to try and put together some characterization of where some of the key elements of Nigeria's maritime space. And I think it's particularly important to take a look at the issues around shipping connectivity, because what that shows is that Nigeria's shipping connectivity index is declining. And shipping connectivity, or linear shipping connectivity, is simply about ease of access. How easily do you connect through Nigerian ports, across Nigerian ports? And I think these are issues that we need to bear in mind. For us, it's quite important as we look that we can see some significant relationships between the macroeconomic environment and the maritime environment. And it's not very difficult to understand. There are at least two dimensions that bring this into sharp focus. The first is our trade. Nigeria is an international trading country, both in terms of exports and in terms of imports. Beyond that, our oil industry also represents a major element on the economic side that affects the maritime sector. All of that said, what do we think to be those key economic parameters that should be taken into consideration when looking at where the maritime sector might go from here? Certainly, on the domestic side, we're very clear what happens to economic growth. We're also very clear what happens to trade. Beyond that, we're also very clear as to what happens to the availability of foreign currency. Fortunately, as we have seen in the past couple of weeks or in the past couple of months, the foreign reserve numbers have risen for about $42 billion currently, which therefore speaks to an improved ability to trade, and therefore we should expect to see greater activity in maritime. But as I said earlier, it's not just about domestic things. International impulses also will affect Nigeria's maritime space. And at the very least, it's important to bear in mind that regulation of Nigeria's maritime also does take a significant proportion of its content from the domestication of international agreements to which Nigeria is signed up. And one of the key dimensions in the report that is being presented today is a section where NIMASA has set out those international regulations that will either be domesticated in 2018, 2019, or those that have already been domesticated but which will take effect in 2018, 2019. And I think it's important that industry operators bear this in mind. And so for us, this is how we think the maritime sector kind of gets driven. Domestic impulses, international impulses. If we are going to do any forecasts, we need to be clear what our assumptions or what the key parameters are going to be. On the domestic side, what's going to happen to macro policy? The budget is in passage at the moment. Monetary policy, regulatory policy and legislation, and also political risk. And please don't let us ignore the point about political risk. We have seen elections go awry in other parts of the African continent more recently, even though our expectations is that the elections in Nigeria will go quite smoothly. On the international side, we certainly expect oil prices and the issues around oil production. What happens to the alliance between OPEC and non-OPEC members in controlling oil production? And on the Nigerian side, the Delta has remained calm, and the key question then becomes, hopefully, will the Delta continue to be calm? And hopefully that gets a positive answer. In trying to put forecast numbers together, what we've sought to do is to create 3 scenarios. And let me explain that very carefully. Forecasts, and everybody's got to be clear about these, they simply represent a possible state in the future. And that possible state in the future is defined by whatever assumptions you make. For us, therefore, we have chosen as the baseline to represent the most likely state of play in the Nigerian economy by parameters that have been defined by the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. As I'm sure we are all aware, the ERGP represents the government's articulation of its key programs, of its key direction between now and 2020. And these have been taken to guide us. In preparing these forecasts, 6 different parameters have been considered. What happens to oil price? What happens to oil production? What happens to economic growth? What happens to inflation? What happens to FX reserves? And what happens to exchange rates? Let me make the point very clearly. These forecasts are not comprehensive. What we have sought to do with this inaugural edition is to take a look at activity that will come through Nigeria's maritime, making demands on Nigeria's maritime facilities, especially the ports. And so we have chosen essentially to look at the size of tonnage that is expected to come through Nigerian ports in 2018 and 2019. We have chosen to look at the size of the fleet that will come through, whether inbound or outbound. We have chosen to look at the number of oil rigs that would be demanded. All of these, in our sense, provide operators, policymakers, some foothold in anticipating the demand on facilities. It's important to state that my hope is that going forward, NIMASA will expand the range of these forecasts to cover other things beyond the demand for facilities use. The demand for labor is important to be forecasted, but it's also quite important that some of the regulatory issues are made apparent very quickly. As you look, the table there simply defines the various scenarios. Again, when you take a look at the report in its detail, you are able to appreciate the numbers that there are. But these numbers simply speak to an economy that is recovering and steadily becoming more resilient. In other words, our view for the Nigerian economy is rather more positive than its recent